Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa has signed off a 3% increase for all public office bearers, with the increment backdated to the 1st of April 2022. Now, the adjustment comes after recommendations which were made by the Independent Commission for the Remuneration of Public Office-Bearers, which proposed an increment of 3.8% for the 2022-2023 financial year. Is this increase reasonable? That's the question we're asking today, considering the state of our economy and the cost of living. Will we speak to political analyst Dr. Oscar Van Heerden? He joins us via our video link. Dr. Van Heerden, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us on the Weekend Report. I'll pose that question to you. I mean, is this increment reasonable given the serious economic challenges that South Africa is currently facing?
It's one from the bat. One would say it's not reasonable. Obviously, you would know that the public servants got an increment of 7.5%, and so 3% seems rather low. It's below inflation, of course, but I do think, it's an election year, as you know. We are going for a general election, and the optics does matter. Already, you would know, people generally out there feel that government officials are getting huge salaries, very high salaries. And so I think the presidency is saying, for the optics, because it's an election year, we'll just do 3%. But it's not.
Well, talking about those optics and the high salaries that we know public office bearers are used to taking home, upwards of R1 million, 2 million rands in some instances annually. The concern is how this massive wage bill often crowds or overcrowds spending when it comes to other priorities. And I wonder if, enough thought is being given to the fact that there are other pressing issues that need to be addressed that require funds to tackle this energy crisis that we're facing, that is really creating a lot of despondency just in terms of our economy, making it sluggish, unable to grow, crippling businesses. The list is endless. And so the question around priority is another one, right?
Absolutely. I mean, look, for example, that government is the largest employer in the country. And this wage bill the public sector wage bill has always been of concern. There has been many steps taken by government over the years to try and curtail, try and curb, try and manage the wage bill. But the truth of the matter is, as you say, it is hanging heavy on the fiscus. It is a huge dent in the fiscus. But at the same time, you have to understand that government is also a contributor to the middle class, to the black middle class over the last 2 decades. But that doesn't mean that priorities are not supposed to be clear and money should be directed elsewhere. But the wage bill has been a heavy concern for Treasury and for government for a very long time.
Now, you mentioned the fact that we are going into an election year next year and how this plays into the optics. Perhaps just elaborate on that for us a little bit, Dr. Van Heerden. Exactly how and in what light would it paint the South African government going into the elections by, agreeing to the public servants' increment of just over 7% and a lowly 3% for public office bearers?
Yeah. I mean, the thing about the 3% is that firstly, as I said, it's below inflation, obviously. And the truth is that we all know the cost of living has gone up. The war between Russia and Ukraine, oil prices, gas prices, has all contributed to the fact that the cost of living has gone up. The inflation on basic food services, basic food prices have gone up by around 11%. Transport costs have gone up around upwards of 15%, and yet you get an increment of 3%, and you are supposed to cope in this environment. And I think for the elections, the point I'm making about the optics is that everyone is suffering. All our people are suffering, especially those that are getting a mere 350 rand per month from government to try and make ends meet. And I think they are all watching keenly to say, here are people, yes, they are doing good work. And I think it's important to say the public office bearers are magistrates, judges, officials of the IEC, the Auditor General, the Public Protector, and of course Cabinet, ministers and deputy ministers. And I think it's important that we all recognize that they do a phenomenal job. They keep our government ticking over, but people are watching and saying, how can they want to get these high increases when we are all suffering? And I think that's probably what President Ramaphosa was having in mind, not even complying to the recommendation of 3.8%, and rather saying, I think I'll drop the 0.8 and only make it 3% because of the situation on the ground.
But why increase it all, Dr. Van Heerden? I mean, we're also talking about a country that suffers from being the most unequal society in the world. And so we are year in, year out seeing the gap between the rich and the poor grow wider and wider. Though government is trying to address the inequality, the issue of inequality through the grant, as you've mentioned. I mean, you would have seen in all of the presidential imbizos, communities really trying to get the point across to the president that even that meager SRD grant is not enough. Talks around the basic income grant have stalled. We don't see any progress there. And yet we're seeing increments for public office bearers who are already earning more than enough and are given additional housing. They don't have to pay for transport costs. I think it really does speak to a sense of a government that is tone deaf to just how bad things are, not just for the poor and the suffering, but also on that gap, the issue around the gap, how wide it is between the rich and the poor.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think it should be said, it should be said that government, we have a very, very extensive social welfare system in South Africa. More than almost 20 million people are on grants. And as you say, that is a direct attempt to try and narrow the gap in terms of poverty and in terms of inequality. But having said that, you're absolutely right. There are talks. I do think, in that light, that come the opening of Parliament next year, I think we're going to get some big announcements with regards to that very social wage that you've mentioned. It just makes sense that somehow that needs to increase in order to even further narrow that gap between the haves and the have-nots. As to should we even have an increment for employees, that is a labor relations matter, and it is governed by law. I'm sure you would agree, in as much as it sounds very unfair, those public office bearers are entitled to some form of increment. And you must also remember that, with these wage negotiations, what's been happening now of late is that they also talk of multi-year negotiations as a mechanism of trying to contain the ever-increasing demands. You would know that the trade union movements were all upwards of double digits. They wanted 10 and more % to try and really address this inflation issue. But unfortunately, there is just not enough cash in the purse.
Indeed. Well, Dr. Van Heerden, thank you so much for coming onto the program and sharing your insights with us as we continue to get more reaction with regards to the president's decision to increase those salaries for public office bearers.